Hello my lovely lot, and welcome back to a brand new Stadia review here on my channel. If you are new here, hi, my name is Flora, and I like to talk about the theatre a lot. Now, I don't consider myself a professional theatre critic or pundit or anything like that, because I do feel like that paints an entirely unrealistic expectation of the review you are about to receive. It feels stuffy, it feels sensible, and I don't identify with any of that. Instead, I like to consider myself merely a musical theatre opinion haver, and boy, do I have a lot of opinions. Today I'll be sharing with you all of my thoughts and feelings about the West End production of The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which has just extended its run at the Ambassadors Theatre and which I was kindly invited to go and see. As usual, before we get into all of my thoughts and feelings, I'll bring you guys up to speed with a little bit of the history of the production as well as a synopsis as to what the show is about, so that we're all on the same page and you guys can contextualise everything I'm about to say after that. So to start, let's cover the production's history. The musical production of Benjamin Button started its life long before it ever graced a West End stage. It actually began 8 years prior to now when a group of writers got together and began working on a musical set in Cornwall. It's this musical that they started working on 8 years ago that would eventually evolve and transform into the Benjamin Button musical that we know today, which started off with 2 off-West End runs at the Southwark Playhouse in 2019 and 2023. The 2023 production is what would then transfer to the Ambassadors Theatre on the West End in 2024. And as I said earlier, it has now been extended through until May 17th, 2025, which means if my review so convinces you, you have plenty of time to go and see the show for yourself. But regardless of where this musical got its origins, what exactly is this musical about? Well, let me explain. Obviously, if you hadn't guessed already, this musical is based on the story of the same title, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Yeah, the same guy that wrote The Great Gatsby. And at its most simple, Benjamin Button is a story of a man who is born old and then ages backwards, so he gets younger the longer he lives. However, the musical transposes the story, which originally took place in 1860s Baltimore, and moves it to set it in 1920s onwards Cornwall. We follow Benjamin over the course of his life from birth to death and watch him learn to live. We watch key moments of his life such as his birth, him falling in love and him starting a family over the course of the show, with these key moments being presented as chapters of sorts. Like, it's such a hard story to describe. I'm not really sure how to kind of better explain it without giving you a literal play-by-play of the show, which none of us have time for. But yeah, the key thing you need to know is basically it is the story of a man who is born old and then ages backwards. And as always, I do also like to clear up with you guys my relationship to the show prior to going in to see it. And I knew nothing about The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. I didn't even know it was a story by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I thought that man's only book was The Great Gatsby, I won't lie. Apparently there is a film based on the book as well, starring I think Brad Pitt and Cate Blanchett, but you're probably realising now that I've not seen the movie or read the book. So I went into this show blind as a bat, knowing very little. So with my limited knowledge of the source material, let's find out exactly what I thought about the musical The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. And like always, we're going to be starting with the highlights. My first highlight, I think, is one that people probably won't be expecting, but I have to shout out the sound design of this show. It's not often that sound design gets a shout out at all, but I think Luke Swaffield did a fantastic job with this show. The sounds of the show literally draw you in from the moment you step into the auditorium to find your seat. You're instantly met with the sounds of coastal life, like seagulls and the tapping of rigging against the masts of fishing boats, all of which really helps sell you on the location of the show you're about to watch. The sounds of the ocean too really felt like they were surrounding you all around the theatre, which made the show feel really immersive, even though it's not being marketed as such. So I had to obviously give that a shout out. And I think the soundscaping of the show also really ties in well with the set of the show. The two elements went hand in hand. The set itself was designed to kind of resemble a storm-weathered harbour or like a wooden jetty, with cleats from which you might moor your fishing boat to fishing nets and buoys, or buoys to you Americans out there. It's really obvious right away that you're in some sort of British fishing village. Literally all I was missing was maybe some salt air and the smell of fish and chips to really complete it. Up close there were even more details that really helped sell the idea of the set being this weathered old pier. This included barnacles and seaweed as well as splintered wood, which really made it visually apparent that we were looking at some sort of fishing village that had been there for years, long before we ever arrived to watch the show. Even the small pieces of set that got moved around by the cast during the performance were themed to look like the old wooden crates that fishermen used to carry their fish around in, which I thought was really clever. All of this attention to detail, like I said, worked to create a set that instantly took the audience to where they needed to be. We were right there in this Cornish fishing village, right alongside the cast. It felt really lived in and used and fit to purpose. And I actually really enjoyed the fact that they didn't take very many creative liberties with it. They pretty much recreated what an old wooden pier looked like right there on the stage in front of us. I think this at least allowed me to really suspend my disbelief when it came to the story of the show, because I wasn't having to work hard to suspend my disbelief with the set, because the set wasn't pulling any punches with regards to what it was trying to be. And so I think the set being so accurate was a real benefit to the show, which does have its own whimsical elements that it's trying to get the audience behind. The set also contained like a number of little secrets or fun hidden elements that I really enjoyed being caught by surprise by. The two primary secrets I'm referring to are going to be a little sand pit that was in the set, as well as one flap that pulled up to basically allow an actor to dunk his head in some water, which happened at a really poignant point in the show. And both of these were used to really great effect in the show. And so I'm glad that the set was able to incorporate these. So a big well done to set designer Jethro Compton, as well as associate stage designer Anna Kelsey, who I think did a genuinely outstanding job of bringing a Cornish fishing village to a West End stage. The next thing I want to highlight, and I think some of you are going to think this is slightly odd, but I want to highlight the changes from the book. And some of you are probably sat there going, Flora, how on earth can you talk about changes made from the book when you've not read the book? And you're probably right, how can I comment on it? But I'm going to do it anyway. Because like I said at the start, the key change made here is that Benjamin Button the Musical takes the story of Benjamin Button, rips it away from Baltimore in the 1860s and brings it to Cornwall in the 1920s. And I really like this change because I genuinely feel had they set it in 1860s Baltimore, the show would have had a much harder time succeeding with British audiences. I know the directors and writers of this show really wanted it to come across as a love letter to Cornwall, and I feel like that really came across throughout the show, as opposed to a show being written in a setting wherein which the creative team has no connection to that setting. If the show hadn't been set in Cornwall, I'm not sure it would have had the same passion and energy really drawing you into the story. The writer's knowledge of Cornwall and love of Cornwall, I think, gave all of the characters, they felt really deeply rooted within the setting of the show. And as such, even though the show is literally about a guy who ages backwards, it all felt really lived in and really believable in a way that I feel like I have seen other shows fail to accomplish. And obviously, aside from changing the setting, other changes were made to account for that change in setting. A few character names are changed here and there, as well as settings throughout the show. Similarly, many events that happen in Benjamin's life have been tweaked slightly. For example, instead of taking over his father's company and then going off to fight in the Spanish-American War, Benjamin instead takes a job on a fishing boat, then goes and fights in World War II. I think in doing this, they make the character of Benjamin much less pitiful than he comes across in sort of the vibes I get from other adaptations of this story, and therefore helps him stand on his own as a character. And therefore I think the changes that have been made, like the really obvious ones, have actually really benefited the story and helped refresh it and revive it and make it more endearing to UK audiences. Like maybe if I'd read the book, I'd be able to sit here and provide a better commentary on all of the changes and how they affect the story and whether I think the changes were worth it. But I'm dyslexic and I ain't got time to be reading the whole book for you guys, so this is the best you're going to get. So all I can really say is that of the changes I am aware of, I'm glad those changes were made, as I think it really helps benefit the story and the overall effectiveness of that story on a UK stage. And speaking of story, one of those key elements of the story, as we keep mentioning, is the fact that Benjamin Button ages backwards. And prior to going into the show, I really had no idea how they were going to accomplish this, because it wasn't like they could just CGI the actor's face and make them look 10 years younger like they can do in movies. But I have to say, John Daglish's way of basically de-aging himself was fascinating to watch on stage. It amazed me how a few simple changes in posture and facial expressions really could make it seem like John himself was de-aging throughout the show, as opposed to just the character aging backwards. Of course, this de-aging effect does only apply up until a point. I don't think anyone's going to believe that John is a 16-year-old, no matter how good his skincare routine is. But the fact the show and John himself were able to achieve the effect of having one man start the show at 70 and then age backwards was really brilliant to watch, and a really fun thing to watch, actually. I really enjoyed it. And then the final highlight I'm going to mention is the fact that this show chose to use actor-musicians. Now, for those of you not in the know, an actor-musician is kind of what it says on the tin. It is an actor who is also a musician. This casting decision in the case of Benjamin Button allowed the music throughout the show to be performed by the actors on stage, removing the need for a band. As someone who can't really play any instruments, let's be real, I always find actor-musicians incredibly impressive and enjoyable to watch on stage. The number of cast members who I saw play 2 or more instruments over the course of the show was outstanding. And boy, were there a lot of instruments. Like, they just kept making instruments appear. There was one point where a guy appeared with a trombone that I was like, where have they been hiding that? Probably off stage, but still, it did seem to appear out of nowhere. The spoons, an instrument I can play, also got their moment in the spotlight, which I loved. And I think, aside from the fact that actor musicians are very impressive to watch on stage, the show's decision to use actor musicians really lent itself to the idea that lots of this show took place in a tight-knit fishing community. It really gave the vibes of like Friday night down at the pub where everyone had come together to play music and sing and enjoy one another's company. It also really suited the show's musical style, and I do genuinely feel as though had they gone with the more traditional band and chorus sort of setup, there would have been a little bit more of a disconnect between the music and the show. It just wouldn't have felt the same. But there you have it, kiddos. Those were my highlights for Benjamin Button, and now it's time to get on to the lowlights. And my primary lowlight, the biggest lowlight, is definitely going to be clarity. I really did struggle with the clarity of some of the lines in this show. There were times where it really felt like the instruments were overpowering the vocals, making the lines hard to follow, and in some cases leading to a little bit of confusion. It's possible that due to where I was sat in row E, so really close to the front, that I was actually able to hear the instruments louder because I was close to them and could therefore hear them organically, as opposed to just being fed the audio mix of the microphones and then the mics on the instruments, which could explain why it sounded so instrument dominant. And I do wonder whether sitting somewhere else in the theatre might rectify this issue. But that being said, this issue did really make it feel as though some moments in the show just kind of washed over me, as opposed to me really being able to like follow and pinpoint where the story was going. It didn't have a vast impact on my overall ability to understand the story of the show, but it was just a tad disappointing because, especially given that we're not exactly early on in the run of this show, I felt like I should have been able to understand and hear the lines a lot better than I was able to. So I had to put that in a low light, even though it's not a direct criticism of the story or the styling of the show. And then my next low light's going to be localism. Now, I know localism isn't maybe the right word I should be using here. I just didn't really know what else to call it because this is such a niche nitpick, and I know like some people are gonna get mad at me for it, but deal with it. If you're going to use real locations in your show, locations that your audience members may be familiar with, please make them feel realistic. If you're going to set part of your show in Portsmouth and then subsequently the Second World War, maybe visit Portsmouth, or I don't know, Google it, because the Cornish setting of the show felt so real, and then we moved everything to Portsmouth. It just kind of felt really jarring how unrealistic Portsmouth felt. Now, maybe it's because I'm a military kid who grew up in and around Portsmouth and so knows it maybe better than the average West End attendee might, but its inclusion really drew me out of the story. So excuse me while I nitpick just a little bit, because whilst yes, there were 2 British naval ships called the HMS Falmouth. Neither one of them were one of the 4 British ships that took part in the D-Day landings, even though the show claims that Benjamin Button was on the HMS Falmouth and took part in D-Day. Now, I do respect potentially the decision to use a fictional ship so as to be perhaps more respectful to the real historical events and the real people that did lose their lives in this battle. I just found it interesting that we went with a ship name that is a real ship name of ships, but neither of those ships were ships involved in the battle we're talking about. Like, maybe just make up a new ship name if you're going for a kind of fictional retelling of Portsmouth and of the British Navy and of D-Day. Commit to it being fictional. Another thing, and I think this is, people are either gonna absolutely hate me for saying this or get a kick out of it, because there is a moment where Eloin and Benjamin leave the naval ball and go for a walk and find a bandstand so that Benjamin can dance with her without being embarrassed because he's never danced before. All of the bandstands in Portsmouth in relation to where this Navy ball is supposedly taking place, and I'm talking bandstands past and present, so I'm including the ones that aren't even standing anymore, all of them are a minimum of 40 minutes walk away from where this ball would likely have taken place. It's not an issue, right? Like, it's not an issue with the show, but like, Jesus, that's a long walk. And that's all I could think during their like slow dance first kiss scene. Now, like I said, this is such a personal issue because the chances of a Portsmouth local who's also a Navy kid seeing Benjamin Button on the West End is probably pretty slim. And it's very possible to people that live in small Cornish villages coming to see Benjamin Button on the West End that their depiction of Cornwall feels exactly the same as the depiction of Portsmouth feels to me. But it just really did pull me out of the show and broke my immersion in a way which was a little disappointing, but likely an issue only someone like me is going to face. And then my final lowlight, I think, will hopefully make a little bit more sense about me. And then my final lowlight will hopefully make a little bit more sense instead of me rambling like a madwoman about Portsmouth. And that's going to be the passage of time. Now, the passage of time seems like a really odd thing to critique about a show who literally has a massive hourglass in its marketing and time as a really core theme of the show. Yet for me, there were moments throughout the show where the passage of time or the inclusion of references to time and timings maybe wasn't as clear as I would have liked it to be. Throughout the show, the ensemble pretty much narrate events as they're happening, going into great detail at times about like the day, the month, the year, the minutes, and the hours as to when these events are taking place. And for me, this was just like a touch overwhelming. I genuinely felt like I needed to be taking notes to keep up, because being fed details and numbers in such quick succession, coupled with not being able to hear the lines at times, made me feel like I was in maths class, which I feel is never something you want from a musical. I think, and this is a big I think, that the times at which they referenced the days, the hours, the minutes, the seconds throughout the show all kind of tied into one another. I want to say there was a full circle moment where the days, times, hours, minutes at the start of the show looped round and tied up with the days, times, hours at the end of the show. But because I couldn't for the life of me remember any of the numbers they told me at the start of the show, I couldn't tell if that's what was supposed to be happening. Because if that's what they were doing, I think it's fun, but I shouldn't have to be taking like detailed maths notes to understand the full circle moment and really appreciate its full effect, because I just couldn't keep up with the numbers that were being thrown my way. But that was my last lowlight. I feel like this was by and large a very positive review from me. I know we don't get those very often because, you know, I'm grumpy, but I did genuinely really enjoy The Curious Case of Benjamin Button at the Ambassadors Theatre. I think it was an absolute triumph in many ways, in fact. From the stunning sound design and set design to the brilliant use of talented actor-musicians throughout the show, it brought to life a world full of this sort of warmth and authenticity that I feel like you don't see in many shows, and that really helped draw you into the story. The thoughtful changes, bringing it to a slightly more modern era as well as setting it within the UK, I think really allowed the opportunity for audiences to connect with the characters and the settings throughout the story, which made it feel rich, real, and emotionally resonant. However, like I said, there were some moments and some occasions where the story became hard to follow due to muddled lyrics and just the bombardment with numbers. But despite these drawbacks, the show was still really emotional and really gorgeous, and one that I absolutely loved sitting through. And yes, it even managed to make me cry, which not many shows do, let me tell you that. As I said earlier, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button has just extended its run at the Ambassadors Theatre in London, booking through until the 17th of May 2025. So if my review did sway you in some way, then I highly recommend getting tickets for yourself and checking it out. Once again, a massive thank you to the Benjamin Button team for having me along to review this show for you guys. But for now, that is all for me. So if you did enjoy this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss any future theatrical content. Check out some of my other social medias for more of this stagey chaos. And until next time, I will see you in the next one, guys. Bye!